Hello. Today we're going to talk about pet foods that sustain health and longevity for dogs and cats. This is a very important topic. The pet food industry this year is $114 billion in the United States based upon health insurance, pet insurance requests for reimbursement for veterinary visits. And that has increased since 2011. We have data on 2011, 2015, 2017, 18, and 19 is not ready yet. And it started out at $41 billion in 2011, and it's now $114 billion. So this is an absolutely enormous amount of money spent by people appropriately on their companion animals. Now, with the SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 lockdown, people worldwide now are spending more time at home with their pets than they ever have before. And they're starting to recognize things that they had no idea were going on when they were at work or at school or whatever they were doing. And they're learning more about their pet behaviors that can affect their health and longevity, of course, especially if they're doing naughty things at home that we would hope they wouldn't, and that when you come home from work or school, they look perfectly calm and happy to see you, and you don't know what they've been up to, mischief they've been up to during the day, especially when they could get into things they shouldn't be eating that are potentially toxic. So let's take a step back and look at the pet food industry. The pet food industry has climbed because of basically for convenience. There's another reason, and that is many people are not sure if they're home cooking for their pets or home preparing raw food or using scraps from the dinner table, which are not recommended, by the way. They don't know if they're balanced or not. And so not only does the commercial pet food industry with AFCO or other certification of minimum requirements balanced, and they can be comfortable with that. They also could have ingredients that the particular pet cannot tolerate, and that's a very big issue. Now, intolerance to foods in people and animals has been increasing in the last 15 years as we've polluted the environment and changed the ozone layer. And so we have not only the sky, the earth, and the sea are changing in terms of their contaminants as well as their nutrient ingredients. But for example, prebiotics like blue-green algae, they're changed now depending on what waters those algae are collected from. So we have all sorts of new issues associated with global warming, deforestation, the change of agriculture, especially in countries with like Eastern Asia and of course Africa, where there's not enough food protein from livestock, for example, to feed the country and their growing populations. And so we have to look at alternate food sources like insects, like seaweeds, other things that can provide protein. And so we have now, not only for people, but for animals, things like protein powders to replace the fact that in some areas, and especially with today's pandemic, people don't have enough money to feed themselves and care for themselves, let alone worry about what they can feed their special companion animals. And so we have animals, more animals ending up in pounds and shelters. At one point, because people thought they were catching SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 from the pets, which we know now is not true. And then now because people can't afford to feed them. So what do we do now to sustain their health? Well, everything was going along smoothly with big pet food industry making $1 gazillion on all of this, as I've mentioned at the beginning. But in 2018, in the summer, two veterinary nutritionists, one from a vet school in Eastern America, one from a vet school in Northwestern America, told the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that they believed that foods that were grain-free or boutique, like exotic meats and animals and whatever in them, were causing an increase in dilated cardiomyopathy and canine heart disease. Well, this caused an absolute worldwide panic, because what the FDA said was that there was a potential link. They didn't say there was a link. Now, there's no evidence here other than the opinion of these two academics, the one on the East Coast program being funded by Nestle Purina, the one on the Northwest being funded by Colgate-Palmolive, that's Hills. And in fact, that person is a golden retriever breeder. And so the first thing they said was, there are some animals that are dogs that are genetically predisposed to canine heart disease. Dobermans, Irish Wolfhounds, German Shepherd dogs, American Cocker Spaniels, you can go on, Salukis, Boxers, you can go on. And then there's all the suspected breeds that have an increased predisposition, like St. Bernards and Newfoundlands and English Cockers, and gosh, we can go on and on and on with the list, and Scottish Deerhounds, and that's not proven. However, what these two groups said was there were more golden retrievers than they expected based on the potential, and therefore golden retrievers had a genetic predisposition or were perceived to have that, and therefore they couldn't eat any grain-free diet, because if they were on a grain-free diet, they'd get heart disease. Well, everybody stopped feeding the grain-free diets. And what became even worse, Amris, is that the FDA listed the reports. There were 492 reports to the FDA of potential issues in the dog, and 9 in the cat. That's all. So the cat wasn't a major concern in this issue. And what they did was they listed the pet foods that were most commonly reported, implying that they could be the ones involved. Now, the problem was they got sued by those pet food companies, of course. Not that you can sue the government, but whatever. So this doesn't mean that those animals had more problems because they fed that food. It just happened to be statistically the ones that had more cases reported to them. Okay, so there were 16 listed. This was huge. Now, people like myself said, wait a minute. In same year, 2018 in October, we said, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. There's no evidence. You need to be sure that grain-free is a problem. You can't link that. And if the animal has a genetic predisposition to get heart disease, it could develop it anyway, regardless of what the food was, as long as it was balanced. Well, the jury is now closed and the thing is finished, because there are now 2 major publications this year in the Journal of Animal Science. One, an invited review by, I guess, about 20 authors that said there's no statistical evidence that this was ever true. And they went through the original reports line by line and showed how they were just impressions and not proof. The second article took another look at it and said, you're absolutely right, there's no proof. And furthermore, a board-certified cardiologist at St. Kitts in the Virgin Islands wrote a paper, actually presented a paper at the internal medicine meetings when all this was going on. And we don't know whether she still survived it or not, but her paper showed that she fed entirely vegetarian balanced diets to dogs for 90 days. And showed no change in any cardiac functions, including echocardiography and whatever. So she said her data clearly showed that pets could eat only a plant-based diet for 90 days and not have any risk to their heart health. Now, what's interesting about that is dogs are not carnivores like cats. Dogs are obligate omnivores. And about 20 years ago, some people in Scandinavia determined that the genetic basis, the genomic identity of the dog had changed to adapt to the current feeding that they were getting, traveling from people that became nomadic hunters to gatherers of crops and field grains and whatever. So the pets that followed them had to adapt to digest starch or they wouldn't survive. So the body adapted and they obtained 3 new genetic markers that allowed them to digest starch. So that's why dogs are obligate omnivores now, and they can eat plant-based foods. In fact, my co-author of our nutrition book, Diana Larvadura, and I are writing a new book due next summer entirely on plant-based foods for dogs, balanced. And that excludes insect, because I'm a vegetarian, she's a vegan. Insects are not vegan because they have, animal-based parts and covers. So it's very interesting. And so what we now know, as we evolve the diets for dogs and cats, we know that grain-free diets are perfectly fine. Many premium food companies feed balanced grain-free diets now. And so that issue should be put to rest. However, even in Southern California, where we practice in our holistic medicine clinic, we still get cardiologists in our area telling the clients that they've got to feed a food with grains and get off the grain-free special diets when their animals are in perfect health. I mean, intuitively looking at them, they're healthy. How can that be right? And so they're still telling them because either they've read the literature, recent literature, which is just this year now, the definitive literature, or they haven't read it. And if they've read it, they don't care. They're not going to buy into it because they've been programmed to identify diets without grains, no wheat, corn, soy, etc., as being unsafe. So the next dilemma we have about how do pets thrive and stay healthy is, do you eat a raw diet? Do you eat a processed diet? Do you eat a home prepared diet? Do you eat kibble? What do you eat? Well, the best diet is obviously raw. There's no question. The fresh ingredients, organic, raw. Why does it have to be organic? Because we now know from the recent published literature that all non-organic foods, carbohydrates, vegetables, whatever, are contaminated with Roundup, glyphosate. So all of us, humans and animals alike, should be, whenever you can, eat organic foods, because they are not sprayed like all the other food substances are with glyphosate. And glyphosate is carcinogenic, and it does all kinds of horrible things to the body. I mean, there's no question about that. There's a moratorium on its use in European countries, in some South American countries. We're trying to avoid it. So what do people do when they can't afford enough proper foods for their pets these days? And they certainly can't afford organic, human-grade foods for their pets. They go to the local farmers market, if possible, in the area, because most of the farmers in the area know what's safe and what needs to be done in the area that they come from. Although I saw a recent article this last week that said that the farmers market products may be fine and not sprayed with things like glyphosate, but there's also contamination with bacteria and other things around the benches and underneath the food stalls and whatever. So we've still got the issue of our people doing proper distancing, proper masking, proper soap and water washing of their hands and all, so they don't contaminate. We're not just talking about SARS-CoV-2, we're talking about the flu season, we're talking about everything. So anyway, definitely raw is the best if you can do it. We avoid chicken and venison, whether it's raw or cooked, because those are pro-inflammatory hot foods in Chinese medicine. So we don't want a hot food, especially for an animal that may have a bowel problem or some other skin itching or clinical signs that could be a food intolerance. So we don't do that. So let's say that people say, oh, and the raw diets today are not sterile, but no food is sterile. You can take a kibble and culture it, and you'll grow all kinds of salmonella and campylobacter and listeria, and even sometimes E. coli 157. So the raw diet's going to be the same. But we have commercially available raw diets that are freeze-dried, dehydrated, or subjected to high-pressure pasteurization. Those are not unsafe, not at all. If you want to make your own raw diet, you need to get a recipe that's balanced from a qualified veterinary nutritionist or animal nutritionist. We offer those all the time, for example, as do others. And what you can do, you buy human grade, preferably grass-fed meats. The reason is that if not, there could be corn in the flesh of the meat, and corn is GMO, genetically modified field corn. And so you've got corn and other grains that's been fed to the meat in the flesh. And so you're not avoiding the things you want to avoid for health. So it needs to be grass-fed whenever possible. So let's say you get grass-fed beef and you're good and it's lean beef, and you've bought it and it's human grade, and you say, how can I make sure it's safe? You put it into small amounts for every 2 days or 3 days, whatever is possible, depending on the size of the pet. You dip these amounts before you freeze the meat in grapefruit seed extract or grape seed extract. And that basically cleanses the surface of the meat. And then you put it in the freezer. Now, when you've put it in the freezer, you're basically going to stop any bacterial contamination from multiplying. They're still going to be there, but they're not going to multiply, and they're basically dead. Okay? So then you can feed it. If you want to cook it, you just sear it on the outside. And don't make it too pink inside. It needs to be, you know, not dripping with juices, but pinkish, and then seared on the outside. So that's raw or slightly cooked for home prepared balanced diet. If you do a kibble, it should be premium and grain-free, absolutely, without any question. And there are many, many kinds on the market these days. And if your pet has a food intolerance, you need to look at the options, and you can do that easily online of what now. The food could say it's, let's just use an example. It's salmon and sweet potato. Great. Salmon's a wonderful protein. It's relatively high in fat, so you wouldn't give it to an animal with pancreatitis, for example, inflammation of the pancreas. But let's just take our example, salmon and sweet potato. Now go online and look, and you may find out that it also has chicken meal and barley and fish oil, other fish oils and, quote, natural flavors, whatever. And then the other thing you need to watch for is the herbs that are not safe for epileptics or animals from families with epilepsy. So those are neurotoxins, and that would be rosemary, oregano, fennel, and sage. So when you look at commercial pet food, whether it be grain-free or with grain, and we're recommending grain-free, many, many of them have rosemary as a preservative. You don't want to feed that. Nor do you want, so if you're making your own food, you don't want to put mixed Italian herbs in that because you're going to get oregano. So you just have to be careful about those things. And you can go online and ask which herbs are neurotoxic, and you'll be told that. The same thing with oils, essential oils. Okay, so here we are. You've got your commercial kibble, you're reading the ingredients, you're finding out if your animal can't eat a certain meat, let's say, can't have pork. Okay, so then you need to go online and pick a non-pork food and make sure that in the ingredient list, there's no pork. Now, people think that if the ingredient is number 10 on the ingredients are listed in order of the amounts. So the first ingredient has more of it in the food than the second and the third. So people say, well, I know I can't have rosemary, but it's number 12 on the list and I can still use it. No, 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 you can't. It's still there. And the animal is acutely intolerant, so you can't use it. We had an interesting story about a client who had an animal with a food intolerance and had done our Nutriscan testing, the saliva testing, and the dog was reactive to, it's Belgian Malinois, was reactive to about 3 foods, no problem. Actually, no, sorry, a German Shepherd dog, about 4 years old at the time. So they stopped feeding those foods and the dog was doing fantastically. Dog is now 9, wasn't doing well suddenly, and they didn't know what was going on. So they did another Nutriscan test, which means you still can't eat the first 3 foods, but my gosh, there were a whole bunch more foods. And she said, well, I expected that because he's not well, but he's never eaten rabbit and he reacted to rabbit. So I wrote back to the client and I said, do you take him in the park? Are there any wild rabbits around there? Or do you have rabbits around you? She said, oh, we have a mother rabbit and her babies that lives under our porch and she walks around the backyard all the time. So I said, well, what do you think? She said, he must be eating rabbit poop. So you see, sometimes it's a crazy story. And in fact, it's going to be on our website. She's got a picture of her dog and she's going to explain how that happened. So if you get a reaction to a food with a proper test, which would be our saliva test and not the blood tests for foods, you need to be a detective to figure out what happened. You know, sometimes an animal's on a restricted diet and the kids come home from college and they come to the door and the dog is jumping around as always, and they've got a Big Mac Whopper Dopper, you know, they're eating, and they give him some of the hamburger and he can't have meat, you know, so then we have, you know, obviously lots of problems in the house after that for a few days. So keeping animals healthy is really important to pay attention to the diet. Make sure that, and don't say, oh, well, they can occasionally eat something he shouldn't have because it doesn't really matter and they really like it. Well, is it surprising that they like the food? Of course not. The child will like things they can't eat as well, you know, and immune memory is for life. So it's like a child with a peanut allergy. They can't tolerate it when they're young. They shouldn't have it when they're older. So I think that's probably enough basically about how to keep animals healthy, right?